You are listening to ESG News and Views from the Conference Board. ESG News and Views is the Conference Board ESG Center's podcast channel, providing compelling, in-depth interviews with ESG influencers and timely updates on hot-button environmental, social, and governance topics. Listen in to stay in the loop with current happenings and learn best practices in sustainability, corporate citizenship, and governance.
Welcome to ESG News and Views, a podcast series from the Conference Board. I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The ESG Center is an independent, nonpartisan think tank that focuses on corporate citizenship, sustainability, and governance. I'm really thrilled to be joined by Jamie Gamble for the second of two podcasts discussing an essay he wrote called The Most Important Problem in the World. In the first podcast, we talked about whether corporations are legally obligated to act like sociopaths, that is, in the narrow financial interests of their shareholders, to the exclusion of all other interests. The theme of this podcast is, if corporations are sociopaths, what do we do about it? So, Jamie, anything you'd like to add about the scope of the problem here before we turn to the solution?
Well, Paul, thank you for having me. And there's one thing I would add is that part of the reason I chose the word sociopath is that I think of sociopath as a person who doesn't have a conscience. And the solution that I'm proposing, the idea is to create a transparent process by which shareholders can create a conscience for the corporation. And that, I think, it's the process in particular and the reflection of shareholder values. I think, as I said in the earlier podcast, one of the key ways to think about the change that I'm proposing is that we need to not define shareholders down as an entity that cares only about money and recognize that shareholders are people. They have values. And so we should be thinking about shareholders' values, not just economic shareholder value.
Got it. Okay, so what would you do to change the system? Because we talked about the problem here isn't that people at companies are bad people or companies are inherently evil or anything like that. It's just that the rules require companies, in your view, to act in a way that's not in the broader interest of society necessarily. So how would you change the system? How would you change the rules to change behavior?
What I would do is I would have the law would have to change. But what the law would do would not be to prescribe explicitly what constitutes ethical or unethical behavior for the company. What the law would do is to require every public company to have shareholder-approved ethics guidelines that are guardrails. They set up the rules within which the company will operate. So in my view, the maximize rule, what I call the maximize rule, the obligation to maximize shareholder value, would remain in place. But the shareholders would also say, but when you maximize shareholder value, you have to do it within these boundaries of what we think are ethical behavior. I think you'd have to require certain dimensions of ethical behavior to be addressed by the company, which would be how you deal with employees, how you deal with customers, how you deal with consumers, how you deal with the environment, the natural world. And then I have a catch-all for posterity, for the future, because we all know that present bias in decision-making is really a serious issue. So I think those 5 things would be required. And the way I would envision the process working is the board would have to debate, determine for itself what are the guidelines the company would operate on those 5 dimensions. They would have to make that public and propose to shareholders those ethical guidelines. The shareholders would have an opportunity at an annual meeting or at a special ethics annual meeting to weigh in on what those on the ethical proposals, and then ultimately the shareholders have to vote and adopt them. This is a way of the shareholders telling the people who manage the company, these are the constraints within which we want you to operate. And I think for anybody who's reacting to that saying that's crazy, shareholders are all going to want to just maximize their dollar values, there's certainly that drive is going to be there. There's a reason people, want to maximize their income, and that's not just, rapacious greed. These are retirement plans. There are reasons that people need to try to do the best they can here. But it's also true, as I said in the earlier podcast, I've never met anybody who didn't have some lines they wouldn't cross in the pursuit of money. And that's what we're talking about here, is drawing those lines. And that's, I think, what I'm proposing is that we do that really publicly through an open process, and then let companies move on from there. And I do really believe that would significantly change the world.
That's really interesting. So you would have the shareholders approve the rules. Let me just ask about that for a second. Given the concentration of power actually at the shareholder level, do you worry at all that this would give a relatively limited number of institutional shareholders the power essentially to dictate what those ethical rules, ethical guidelines might be across multiple companies?
So I do worry about that. I think that institutional investors are immensely powerful. And today, most institutional investors operate under a fiduciary rule that's pretty much like what I described the maximize rule to be. So if we did the shareholder vote today without changing the way institutional investors are governed, the rule would come out looking pretty much like the maximize rule because that's what the institutions are obligated to support. But in my world, institutional investors are going to have their own ethical obligations. First off, a lot of institutional investors are companies. They're insurance companies. They're already going to be subjected to the same obligation to develop an ethical conscience, and that would then guide their investment decisions. Not all are like that, though, but all of them, just about every single significant institutional investor ultimately gets its money from people. If it's a retirement, if it's a state retirement fund or a university, the TIA, CREF, these huge funds, they get their money ultimately from people. So in my view, in some form, the technical mechanics would be different. Each of those entities would have to go through the same process where the people whose money they're holding on to have to step up and say, these are the rules within which we want you to try to go and make money for us. And it's, again, I think there are going to be people who say that this is a utopian, crazy idea. It's not. The fact is the fastest growing aspect of the money management business is socially responsible investment funds. I think it's gone from, in the late 1990s, somewhere around $700 million invested in these funds to $12 trillion today. Right. It's still a small chunk of the overall market, but it's growing faster than every place else. Every single major investment house today is developing products that are socially responsible funds, and they're issues and concerns about what that really means in terms of the standards.
Right.
But what it says is that everybody who deals with investors recognizes that investors are starting to step up and care about this, just as companies are through that Business Roundtable statement that we talked about in the last session. And I think what I'm suggesting is, yes, and the law needs to change to make it possible for that to really happen deeply at an executable level. And the law needs to change because it needs to give everybody a push. In other words, these ideas that are coming and growing, a push from the law is going to let them scale in a way they're not going to scale otherwise, or they're less likely to scale otherwise.
Got it. So let's say that the board proposes and the shareholders adopt these ethical guidelines. How do you enforce them under your proposal? So
this is where my being a lawyer probably heavily influences the way I think about enforcement, because the first thing that comes to my mind is derivative lawsuits, which I'll explain just a little bit. So a derivative lawsuit is the way a shareholder sues the board of a company, the board and management of a company, for not acting in the best interests of the corporation. Today, what that pretty much always looks like is a shareholder sues and says, you, the board, are not taking an action that would maximize the value of the firm. It happens a lot in takeover context, and that's the basic context. It happens in many contexts, but that's one of the ways it happens often. My view would be you would continue the same enforcement mechanisms that already exist. One of the benefits of doing this in the way I propose is there's a lot of experience already operating the mechanism of enforcement. And the two big ones are going to be shareholder activism. In other words, can we vote out board members who aren't doing what they're supposed to do? And that exists already in a particular direction. I'll get back to this a little bit because I think it's an important benefit of my idea. And then the derivative lawsuit. That is, a shareholder can sue the company for not, in my view, not following the ethical guidelines. Part of the reason this will work is that you only have to own, well, in my world, again, you would only have to own one share in order to have standing to sue. And in the typical derivative context, that's actually true. And in the old days, you and I are both old enough to remember this, the plaintiffs' lawyers, the contingency fee group that wanted to always be the first to file one of these actions because that's how they make their money, would actually have stables of people who owned one share of virtually everything. So there's always somebody they could call and immediately file a lawsuit.
And get to the courthouse.
And get to the courthouse first. And that's because that's how you got primacy in the litigation. So what I think would happen now is you wouldn't have that. What you would have is the Natural Resources Defense Council would buy one share of Exxon and one share of Texaco and one share of the coal company and one share of the power company, so that they would have standing to show up at the annual meeting and talk, and to bring a lawsuit if they thought the ethical guidelines that were adopted through my shareholder participation are not being followed. So now you've created a little private enforcement function, which is the purpose of the derivative lawsuit in the first place. And it's very powerful. I don't think it would run out of control, which is a worry many people express. I don't think it would run out of control because the thing that drives most of the disruptive derivative litigation that exists out there is contingency fees. It's money. And so if you are the lawyer and you bring the lawsuit, you get a slice of whatever the court determines you've made the company by bringing this lawsuit and changing corporate behavior. In the context of an ethics suit, you're not going to have that. There's not going to be money that comes from it. You're going to the benefit you're going to get for the corporation is specific performance. What the court will order is the company to go abide by the ethics rules. So there won't be a fee to collect, which means the dollar incentive to just go out and file as many lawsuits as you can and get in the way of things to make people pay you to go away, which is a lot of what happens. The people who are going to bring these lawsuits are going to bring them because they care, because this is the thing in which they are interested. And because lawsuits are expensive, they're not going to waste them, I think, on frivolous lawsuits. I'm not saying it'll never happen. I'm saying I don't think it'll happen in anywhere near the degree people worry about, and I don't think it'll be anywhere near disruptive enough to outweigh the benefits that will come from it.
So you're looking at shareholders to enforce these ethical guidelines that are in the interests of these 5 different stakeholder groups, or 4 of them plus posterity, right?
Yes.
So I guess a question that comes to mind is how would it work? Let's say you get a lawsuit from a labor union that thinks that you're not doing right by employees. At the same time, you get a lawsuit by the NRDC that thinks, National Resources Defense Council, that thinks you're not doing right by the environment. Would you be able to have multiple shareholders suing for ethical violations? And would the ethical rules be written where the board would have some flexibility in balancing the interests between the environment and customers and employees and posterity? Or would the obligations be sort of strict, like you must do this or you must not do that, so you could actually face multiple lawsuits from different types of shareholders for an ethical violation?
So I think part of the beauty of the way I'm approaching this is that the new rules sit in a very old construction of how the law really works. So there's something called the business judgment rule, which I know you are aware of, but for listeners' purposes, the business judgment rule is a rule. It's in Delaware law, but pretty much everybody abides by it, that says as long as the board follows its duties of care and loyalty, which means if it's not basically making money for itself at the corporation's expense, and it's done the homework to actually really study and understand the problem in a reasonable way, that a court will not substitute the court's judgment for the management of the companies. That's the business judgment rule. It results in a lot of deference to board decisions on business matters, which makes a lot of sense because that's who's supposed to be making those decisions. That would continue. So yes, there would be a great deal of flexibility, and mostly what the court would want to look at is, has the board done the homework? Have they looked at all the effects on these various constituencies within the context of these specific ethical rules that the company itself has devised? Short answer to your other question is yes, you could have multiple lawsuits. Yeah. In a very simplified way, let's say a coal company has decided it's going to close a coal plant, and it's doing it for economic reasons as well as environmental reasons as well as others. And the people who live in the town or the miners say, hey, we're going to sue because we think you're not properly considering our interests in making your decision. At the same time, the Natural Resources Defense Council brings a suit and says, no, you do have to close the mine because that's what's in. So now you have 2 different lawsuits asking you to do 2 different things. So as a litigator, the lights immediately go on for me. So this is the best thing that could possibly happen to a board, because all I have to do is walk into the court and say, Your Honor, I'm obviously considering seriously all of the appropriate interests, because I have one group that's telling me I'm going the wrong direction, and another that's telling me I'm going the right direction, because they have competing interests. It's my job to balance them. Obviously, I've considered them enough that these folks are jumping on me already from different directions, and so you're not supposed to interpose your judgment instead of mine. So I'm the person the board, and the person who gets to do the balancing of that. So I think, you could, and frankly, you do see them now.
Right.
So it's not, again, that's not new. This is not something everybody would have to invent a solution for. It's stuff that we already deal with. And the system works reasonably well. When I was doing the work on the other side, I would undoubtedly have said, no, this is all incredibly disruptive and difficult and could be done much more efficiently, which is probably true to some extent. But the fact is the system works well enough. And I think it would continue to work well enough in this context.
Okay. It may still scare companies, the prospect of facing a whole new brand of type of derivative actions. But let's, but
let me address that, because this would be my pitch on the reverse. I get that. But I would say that the most disruptive element of shareholder activism today is not coming from people who are worried about the environment or anything else. It's actually shareholder activism driven by large investors who are often looking for behaviors that will create short-term stock hits that are sometimes that management often thinks is at the expense of the long-term interests of the company. So the hedge funds are the typical villains in this scenario. It's not all hedge funds. It's not even mostly hedge funds, but that's the signature place you generally tend to look at this. And I think my system, by creating a broader set of concerns to which the board can look, allows for a much more clear balancing. So the last podcast, one of the things we talked about is that many companies say, well, we already look at all these other constituencies. We just do that in a way that says, because we think their interests are consistent with long-term shareholder value as well. So it requires you to argue around some things often to get there, and companies do that too. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but they do. By being really direct and open about it and saying, no, you have to consider these things. You create a way of responding to that sort of short-termism, very economically driven pressure that doesn't currently exist. And I would submit to most companies the ability to more easily address and remove that disruption to corporate management is going to be a lot more valuable than anything you're going to lose by having to periodically deal more with the environmental groups that are going to come in, or the labor groups that are going to come in and try to push you to do things in their direction. I also think because a process will exist for developing ethics rules in which everybody who wants to buy one share of stock can participate, and that has an enforcement mechanism, some of the other ways in which activists tend to try to influence companies, which are very disruptive, whether it's boycotts or social media campaigns, will decline, simply because it'll be much more difficult to portray companies as these evil, unfeeling, solely economic actors, because they won't be.
Right. So essentially, you're giving companies a defense against those purely economically motivated derivative lawsuits. They can now say, we exercised our business judgment. We acted with care. We acted with loyalty to try to balance these multiple interests. So that's our defense to why we may not have maximized value in the short run here.
That's correct. I think the decision is more complicated and requires more things to be weighed. And as a result, that deference that goes to the board in weighing those decisions will weigh that much more heavily.
Got it. Well, we've already waded a little bit into the next area I wanted to address, which is costs and benefits. So you've clearly given this a lot of thought. So what would you say are sort of the major costs and benefits to individuals and to society if we adopt this regime? Let's start with the cost side, force you to talk about that, and then we'll get into the benefits.
So I think it's a very hard question to answer for a variety of reasons, but mostly because I think in order to really talk about it, you have to break it down into a few pieces. But the very first thing to talk about if you talk about costs and benefits is that there is no static zero from which you measure. In other words, staying in place isn't the zero option, because there is no in place. The economy is dynamic, it's moving. Change is already happening. So what you're really doing is weighing the cost of doing nothing and letting the status quo continue against the cost of doing something. And the cost of doing nothing, if you think about the cost of climate change, which even the current administration is estimating in the trillions of dollars, if you think about the costs that come from income inequality and insecurity and the social and political dislocation that comes from that, those costs are huge. So when you think about costs, it's relative costs, it's net costs. It's not just, well, we have a 0 point if we do nothing.
Right, it's incremental, right.
Right. So the breakdown, I think, is to look at it from the perspective first of macro costs, so the economy-wide cost-benefit analysis. And the second is distribution effects. And I'm going to hit them quickly, and then if you want to come back, we can do that because the discussions about them could go on a long time. What I would say in the macro costs is almost surely from a pure dollar perspective, and so let me say, the macro costs in the global sense, I think it's almost unarguable that if you have the most powerful entities in society spending more time thinking about the public good, generally speaking, on a really broadly understood basis, the public good will be better off. It has to be. There's a lot of smart people with a lot of power trying to do something in a little different way. Let's just talk dollar costs because they're important. They're incredibly important. When you think dollar cost to the economy on a macro level, what I would suggest is in those two really critical areas to keep coming back to, which is climate change and income inequality, almost surely a more ethical capitalism is actually going to be net growth positive. So the first is, as I said, the estimates of economic costs of climate change are enormous. Many companies are already recognizing this. The problem is climate is the classic free rider situation. Right? The actual economic value maximizing situation for any company on climate is to be seen to be doing things to help the climate, to not actually do them so you don't incur any costs, but have everyone else actually do them so that the problem is mitigated. Right? It's a classic free rider problem. The law has been trying to deal with it in a variety of things for hundreds of years. And it's hard, right? It's hard. And my last point about this, when we get to distribution effects, will be my explanation for why I think it'll be better this way. The more direct one, though, is income inequality. So I think anyone would expect, or I think it's reasonable to expect, that one of the big income inequality effects of a more ethical capitalism would be profits from a company, the revenues from a company. More of them would wind up directed to lower earning members of the corporate world rather than higher earning members. So less money for CEOs and shareholders, more money for the rank and file employees is the easiest way to say it. In the world in which we live, in which most investment is not capital constrained, and I can't pretend to explain that, but the whole idea of a savings glut seems to be real because we seem to be able to not get interest rates or inflation to go anywhere. So I don't think there's much in the current world that indicates we're highly constrained from an investment perspective, from a capital perspective. So having less money go to shareholders and CEOs probably doesn't affect investment decisions that much because there's enough money out there chasing projects. But having more money go to lower in the lower part of the income scale, that money's more often spent. This is a sort of common truism of economics. People who are lower in the income scale, when they get more money, they tend to spend it. That means the velocity of money increases. The increased velocity of money tends to increase growth. So it's almost surely pro-growth, at least in the near term, for so long as the economy isn't capital constrained, which appears to be right now a long-term phenomenon. So I think between those two things, the macro effect is clearly most likely to be positive to the extent that it's predictable. The distribution effects are harder. So there's a wonderful analogy in distribution effects to trade. So I think it's still generally received economic wisdom among almost everybody that free trade increases the size of the pie. It increases growth overall. It's also, everybody agrees that it has serious distribution effects. That growth goes to different places, and some places suffer terribly when trade comes in because it changes the way the economic landscape functions. The distribution effects matter a lot. They're part of what contributes to political dysfunction. They obviously contribute to income inequality. And they exist in capitalism generally. People have been trying to figure out the distribution problem, and there is no real solution. Communism tried, and everybody who tried it that way turned into a horrifying nightmare. So you're going to have to live with distribution problems. The question really, from my perspective, is will you do better under an ethical capitalism than you do by trying to regulate through sort of some redistributive government program? And I think the answer is yes, which takes me back to also why I think this is better for the economy. And I'll use the coal company example. So imagine today a coal company wants to close a mine. It's because gas is cheaper, and this mine is in West Virginia as opposed to the Powder River Basin in Wisconsin, and so it's more expensive to mine there. Variety of real economic reasons, all in addition to there's an environmental reason. These companies look and say, so there's a bunch of things that are causing them to make this decision. Today, the way that decision gets made is they have legal obligations to the people who work there, to the communities they operate in, to do cleanup. They're going to meet those legal obligations and maybe do a little bit more, and then they're going to move on. And they're going to say, hey, we did our job. This is what we're supposed to do. Under an ethical capitalism, right from the outset, really, frankly, from the outset of opening the mine, if it's a new one, but certainly from the outset of the discussion about should we close the mine, they're going to be thinking about, because they have to, how does this affect employees? How does this affect communities? Can we build into the structure of how we make this decision a way to mitigate the negative effects on those people? And they're going to have to balance that against the need to close the mine because of their environmental and posterity concerns. The reason I think it will work better to situate that decision at the company level is because the company, first off, knows much more about what it's going to do and how it's going to do it, and can calibrate that to the very specific situation in a way that no regulatory regime could possibly do. And if you take my example and you multiply that over every major decision at every major company, what you're doing is you're breaking the problem down into a lot of very specific decisions, then applying a lot of experience and a lot of brain power to each of those individual pieces of the larger problem. I believe that will give you a better solution than any top-down solution is ever likely to get.
Got it. It also means the decision-making process at companies becomes more involved, more complex, and legally required to be so, but there may be a lot of benefits that come with that. Well, look, we could have a conversation go on a lot longer because there are plenty of other ones like, okay, this is great if some companies, let's say public companies, adopt these ethical guidelines. What happens to private companies? Is there still room out there for the economically motivated, exclusively economically motivated sharks out there to operate? What happens if the world doesn't change? How do those who work at corporations deal with working at a company that may not take all these stakeholder interests into account? So we could go on. We're actually out of time, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. So I just want to thank you for a terrific conversation, Jamie, and hopefully we'll get together again.
And thank you as well, Paul. I really enjoyed it.
It's terrific. And thank you all for listening. Look, you can find this program and others from the Conference Board on conference-board.org/podcasts, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and many others. So thank you again, Jamie. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm Paul Washington with the Conference Board.
This has been ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.